Alright, I'm going to jump in right away just to hopefully get done on time and everything. So this is the second class in the environment art bit. There is a little bit of progress to be made today. Probably a lot, to be honest, because we need to kind of finish our blockouts to get ready to move on to learning about UVs and texturing and all of that stuff. So today's going to be a lot of breaking it down modularly, so getting everything separated into pieces, right? If you remember last time, we built everything up in Blender just as a solid chunk using modifiers and everything to quickly repeat and tile. So this isn't technically a modular kit yet. There are more steps we need to do, so we'll get into that. I might as well go through this while we're here. Right, because we want to get these kit pieces into Engine. At the moment, we're just exporting the entire environment at once and putting it in Unreal. That's not how your environments will be made. That's just for demonstration and testing and getting your character and scale and everything right. Later on, we need to separate everything. So we'll talk a bit about using Unreal blueprints or Unity prefabs to do that. And then as an aside, kind of unrelated, but I wanted to go over organic elements as well. So I used the game jam as an opportunity to sort of cover doing organic pieces. I did a very low poly, but it's the same stages. So I just want to go through that with you and see how that works when we're dealing with like outdoor environments, right? It's a little bit different. I'm going to do that first actually, just to make sure we get through it, and then we can scooch on to refining our blockouts a little bit more. So when we're dealing with outdoor environments, it's the same sort of idea as when we're dealing with our indoor environments, in the sense that our steps are going to be first a blockout, then refined pieces or kit pieces, however you want to call them, and then updating those pieces over time. So
I think there's 3 different cats in this game.
There's 3 images of cats, so they all need their own material. So to get started with it, the very first thing I did is went in and set up a quick blockout. I made one single mountainous looking structure in 10 seconds and a canoe in another 20, right? We're just trying to establish that initial direction and a feel for what our environment's going to look like. Once we're kind of happy with how that's turned out, we can start to turn out actual pieces. So a big part of that is going to be figuring out your workflow. Generally, for this kind of stuff, we're going to be doing some form of sculpting or other. We were doing low poly, so I used a very procedural workflow here with subdividing everything and then decimating it down to get our nice big fat triangles. But if you were doing environment pieces, it would be a very similar process. So I'll just show you here how that kind of works. If we wanted to make like a rock, for instance, it's very similar to how you're currently making characters, right? I'll think about the real world scale. We'll start with something like a cube maybe. And 11 meters is pretty good boulder-ish size, right? We can go ahead and maybe duplicate this a few different times in a few different ways to get more of a rocky kind of shape. So I'll just push this out a bit more. And once we have something we're happy with, just like with the character, right? So organic elements, nature, we're sculpting all of that. Typically, it's much more like a character than it is hard surface. I'm going to combine everything here and go into sculpt mode and just remesh it really quickly. Right, now we can see this has combined everything into a solid mesh, right? And now the world's your oyster. You can create this into any kind of rock you want. It'll of course depend on the original blockout shape. But when it comes to building up the blockouts for your environment, right, just something like this looks terrible, but it's about the right size, and that's all we really care about. At this point, I could take this no problem and put it in my game engine. So you'll notice here all of my pieces are just laid out in space here, right? Everything is centered to the origin. This is how an actual kit's gonna look. Everything needs to be sort of centered so we can export it, because we want to do that level building in the actual editor, right? So all these pieces are separate chunks that would eventually be combined down for the sake of colliders and everything. So yeah, modularity. Make as many pieces as big as possible as you can at the beginning and just export them into Engine as soon as possible so you can start establishing that vision. And then you can start to refine those assets bit by bit, right? So none of these are the none of these are the first versions of these models. At some point, they were all cubes or just other blocky shapes that were eventually refined and re-exported to fit the bill, right?
So what was the theme of your game?
It was for the game jam, but
Yeah. Oh, okay. Well,
you're a frog that climbs a mountain in a canoe. For the next bit, though, this is the most important bit. When we're dealing with these organic environments, the biggest thing is working from large to small shapes. This is what kind of helps things fade in. So you notice when we have such big shapes, what tends to happen is if I take like a mountain, for example, just from this collection of things that we exported, and if I shove this mountain to the ground in any place,
oh no, it's a molehill.
right, it looks okay. But we have all of these areas that are, crashing through other meshes. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but we need to take further action to sort of get everything looking nice and pretty. So we're going to be working from big to small. We have the large environment mountain part, and you'll see I did this on literally every single part of these meshes, right? There's always some large element that then gets broken down into medium elements, that then gets broken down into small elements. So for this example, again, if I pulled this mountain up here, now I want to start looking into medium shapes. You'll notice when I exported my objects, it was the same idea. Big mountains with a couple variations that are very large, smaller, flatter ramps, medium-sized rocks, and mounds, so that we can build those shapes smaller and smaller and smaller, right? So let's add some smaller shapes to tie this together a little bit better. We've got, for example, this ramp piece here, which has much less sort of steepness to it. So if I take this and tie this into parts of the bottom, it helps it fade into the rest of the environment. And we can continue to work downwards. So let's take a large boulder, for instance, right? And this can kind of crash into both of those to help it all sit together, right? And where we had this big long chunk of the silhouette and it was crashing, we now have a much smaller bit. So I'm going to rotate this around a bunch as well to just create some variation. Right? And just continue working downward. So this is also how your DW games are going to be built. You'll notice right off rip, I made a bunch of just colored materials. There's no textures in this game, but you can get a pretty good feel for, if you were to continue working and refining, how everything would be. So I'd recommend you go in and do something like that right off the bat as well, just to get an idea. So if I start applying things now, get a better idea of how this all fits together. Right? When it's the same colors, it works a little bit better. Chunk it together. Then we can continue working down. So now our medium pieces, right? Smaller and smaller details as we go. How are these going to sit, right? We want to break up the big silhouette of it crashing through. We can scale organic pieces a lot more easily than hard pieces because naturally there would be a little bit more deformation and change in organic shapes than there would be in hard surface stuff. Then once you have something, again, you're happy with, you continue to move down. So now I'll move into like getting the smallest pieces down, some trees maybe. Right, this tiny, tiny rocks. Scale it down, move it around, rotate it every so often to get some variation. Right, something like that. I'm not going to continue, but you get the idea, right? And in a very short period of time, with a total of like 6 assets, we've created a much nicer looking space than before when we just shoved our mountain into the ground, right? So we're going to be working big to small when we're doing these organic chunks and trying to reuse our assets as much as possible. The thing that makes organic pieces organic is variation. So I can close that up now. Actually, one last note, that's the same note I've made before, but you should always put your games in a playable kind of state as soon as possible so you get an idea of scale. So if I just hit play, there's a lot of going back and forth with how the character moves and then adjusting the environment before going in and doing all these final little details like big, medium, small stuff. At the beginning, you just want to get everything working.
Yeah, I mean, I suspect we're going to run into an issue because there's a mountain in the way.
Well, I'm not actually going to move around much. It's just to give you an idea, right? So once I have the camera established and everything, I can get an idea of how these pieces are going to fit from the player's perspective.
Oh my god.
And then how they actually move around the space, right? So this all feels just fine. Everything feels to scale.
Oh.
So we would continue on with building up at this point, right? And that's how the whole environment was created. So something like this can be done in a day. I'm sure your environments could be very potent by the end of the semester. So.
Yeah, they could.
All right. So that's organic pieces. Is there any major questions about that? I know it's not something we usually cover, but there are a lot of people who do outdoor environments. Hopefully that helps clear things up. Looks like no, yes, no.
I'm sorry, I'm just asking, do you have a copy of the scene in the download?
The game?
No, like the picture.
Uh,
I mean, the scene in question, like some graphs and we can just look at it, or?
Well, I guess you could play the game, like it's in Unity. You'd have to download my whole repo. So.
Oh, okay. I read it. It's the one where you drop in space, right?
No, it's there on my itch though. You can go play it if you want. Yep, Ethan.
So you were scaling things. That only
Yes.
works because of this like art style, right? Like,
That
if you
only
have textured
works
assets-
because they're organic. So there is a limit to how far you can stretch things, and I'm still stretching things for the most part uniformly, so on all the axes equally. So yes, there will be some texel density mishaps, but that's why we want to make those big, medium, small chunks. That little pebble I made, like I took the medium boulder and made it a pebble. You wouldn't do that. I just didn't have a small pebble on hand because that was too much detail for what we were doing. But yeah, because they're organic, you can get away with variations in the textile density a lot more than you could otherwise. Because again, like organic pieces, there is no correct look to them, right? That concrete wall has a grid shape on it. If I was to stretch it, the one behind you, it'd be very obvious where it was stretched because it repeats, but organic shapes do not repeat. That's the biggest kind of tell. And that's something that we have to deal with when we go through our environment as well, which is tricky because we are doing wood, which is an organic element, but we are hard surface modeling it. So we end up with areas like this roof where you end up with very visible repetition in the tiling. So we'll learn how to deal with that later. It's kind of hard to see because the lights are all messed up right now, but it repeats very egregiously. Okay, so that's organic environments. Yep, you're allowed to scale here and there. It's not too bad. So then next is going to be the hard surface stuff. So let's get into modularity. So we already know that we need to reuse these pieces, but there's a few things that we need to do in order to make these actual kit pieces. We have our test blockout pieces. Let's quickly go over what makes it a kit piece. So first and foremost, when we're exporting these into Engine, they're going to need to be exported from World Center because that's going to set the pivot. So we need to first, of course, pick where we want our pivot points on these objects to be. We did that for a few of them already. For example, this floor already has it in this bottom left corner from this angle. So that's pretty good. But for some things, we can get a little bit more creative with it. If we look at where the environment's at now, we'll see a lot of pieces like these facade-looking pillars and these pillars and the little bits on top. They always appear in the scene together. So what we can do is actually set the pivots of these objects to be in the same point or to be tied in some way to the mesh that we always know it's going to be in that position. So let's get started with doing some of this. I'm going to take our blockout that we made and just move it to a new collection and just call this test or testing or whatever you want. But this is where we're just kind of building up our environment and seeing where things go. So it's obviously not the final pieces. From here, we kind of want to get in here. I'm going to hit Alt-D to make an instance duplicate of everything, right? So from instancing, we know that that means everything here will change mesh-wise if we change the other ones. And I move this to a new collection and just call it testing 2. Organization is really important with this stuff because our files tend to start looking like this. So this is my actual working file for this scene. And you can see I've got just everything, right? Same as the organic kit pieces, everything's just in the same spot. So it is really important to get everything organized from the beginning. Let me turn everything on there. So there you go, right? So you can imagine trying to work in this if it was unorganized would be an absolute nightmare. But because it's organized, we can very easily pick what we want to work on. So for that to happen, I'm going to make a third collection. And I'm going to call this one kit. So this is where our actual finished kit pieces are going to go. So the idea is everything in testing 2, we're going to work it down to a final kit piece. And then once it's done, we'll move it into our kit collection so we know we don't have to worry about it anymore. So we'll call that kit and we'll get started. We'll turn off testing 1. And then here in testing 2, we can just start getting rid of all these modifiers. Right? We want our final pieces. So get rid of the arrays. On everything, get rid of that array. Get rid of this array.
There's got to be a faster way to do this.
I have an add-on at home that would delete all add-ons. I just don't have it on this computer, but there is one that you can add that does that.
No modifiers.
There we go. So at this point, right, we've got a pretty good idea for what we need. But we also know things like this floor, right? This is the same floor piece a bunch of different times. So I only need one of them. I'm going to delete the extra ones. I'll leave this one little chunk because it'll give us a pretty good idea of how everything fits together. And we can even move this over to the other side and just keep everything on the left, for example. So delete all of those. At this point, we're going to have to go through and start naming things because it's impossible to tell what everything is otherwise. So let's start with this at the bottom, right? We know that this is going to be our bookshelf on the bottom floor. I'm going to name it bookshelf_bottom. We can go through and quickly do that for all the rest. Bookshelf_top. I just want to check because I think these might be sharing mesh data. They are, right? But these are going to be separate once we get around to it. So I'm just going to go into the mesh data icon here, the little green triangle. And I'm going to hit this little 4 button. That means there's 4 instances of it. I don't want this to share the instance anymore because this is going to be different. This top bookshelf needs to be a different mesh. So we move it around. It's all separate now.
It's connected to something though.
Nope. It's because I didn't select the vertex.
Oh. Wait, why did that? Huh?
This
you
bit
were in
here.
edit mode when you started moving it. How'd that
No, I
happen?
was in edit mode. So this bit here is, forget the actual real term for it, so I'm just going to call it a facade. Facade, boom. These facades also have these pillars along the halfway points, so I'm going to call this facade pillar. Right, we have a pillar on the bottom floor here, but we know from our reference that we're also going to eventually have a pillar on the top floor.
Those are 2 different types of pillars.
Exactly. So this one is going to be named pillar bottom, so we can keep track of which floor it's supposed to be on, right? You can also go through and just use different naming variations. So the one that I used in the actual project here is, if I click in, I went with A and B. So we have SM bookshelf A, SM bookshelf B, right? SM pillar A and SM pillar B, and these are the different variations. Okay, because we're just doing the blockout and I'm just showcasing the workflow, I'm not going to go and make that second pillar, but this is fine, and we can call this one floor. We can call this piece something, maybe curved roof, or arcade roof, as it would actually be called. because that's separate from our barrel ceiling here. So I can click this and we'll call this barrel ceiling. Okay, so now we have all of our major kit pieces kind of blocked out. Let's double check and just see, yeah, these are also tied together, so we're going to change that because we need one that is wall bottom and we need one that is wall top. So same thing, disconnect, wall top. Okay. This floor piece is just an identical floor piece, so I'm going to get rid of it. And there we have our core assets for our blockout. So now we need to go ahead and turn these into proper kit pieces. And then we're good to start exporting them into Engine. So let me just quickly switch so I don't get this all mixed up. I'll make a second folder here. There we go. So let's start kitting these out. So we need to pick everything. Whoop. And to start, I'm just going to blast it all into the center. So I'm going to move my cursor to the world origin, pick everything, and move it to that world origin. So selection to cursor, right?
I also need the floor.
Yep. So now everything is going to have its origin wherever our 3D cursor is right here. At this point, we want to move the things around so that we get the 3D cursor and that origin point exactly where we want it on all of these meshes. So for the floor and the bookshelves, we've picked the left, the bottom closest to us left corner. I want to keep things as consistent as possible because we're working as much as we can with these 100-meter variations, right? So as long as I keep my pivots for all these things in some form of grid relation to this point, we'll be able to quickly snap everything together in Engine, right? So generally speaking, that means I want to keep my pivot on the bottom left corner of all of our stuff. So let's go ahead and I'm going to duplicate the ground again just to give us an idea of where it's going to sit. And now we could do some funky stuff. So I think the pillar, we could normally drag it out to where it's going to go and say that this is appropriate, right? It still snaps into place. But we could also, because the pillar is going to be in front of a bookshelf 99% of the time, we could put the pillar's pivot point right here. And the reason we would do that is because then in Engine at any point, we could pretend this was the bookshelf, right? I could always just hop in here and change the mesh. So this was the bookshelf, it's now the pillar. The origin point on this is what determines where the model shows up in Engine. So in this case, right, both of these objects have their pivot point right in the center bottom of them. So you can imagine if my pivot point on my pillar was over there, when I replace, right, I could duplicate and replace this bookshelf and my pillar would already be in place.
And you could do the same thing with the pillar top.
You could, in this specific example. I'm not going to, because there are cases where we are going to use these pieces separately. But it's really up to your, decision as an artist. You can choose to pick where you want these things to go. If you think you want them to be super flexible and reusable, give them a more sensible pivot like on the bottom. But if you want them and you know that they are going to specifically interact in a certain way every single time, then feel free to maybe adjust the pivot a little bit. So an example of that is going to be these two. This facade and this facade sort of section here, they're always, always, always going to be tied together. And it's way easier for me to just duplicate one and replace it than to try and snap it all together. So I'm going to pick a pivot for both of these that works, right?
Yeah, you should move the facade up.
Yeah, that's basically what's going to happen, right? So we know that this piece here, it needs to snap to the top of this. So what I'm first going to do actually is just go in here, snapping turned on, and let's see where it fits here. All right, so that's maybe where we want it. Let's see. I think what I'll do actually is use part of this bookshelf to set the pivot. For now, yeah, let's bring this up here. And I need these to snap together perfectly, and it's a little hard with everything in the way, so let's isolate them. I should turn this on. There we go. So I'm going to use snapping here to make sure they snap together. So I'm going to go to vertex. It's going to snap with my origin because I have active selected. So this origin, well, let's snap it up there. And now we know these are perfectly aligned. So let's set our pivot for both of these to be in the same spot. I'm going to hit object, set to 3D cursor, or use the hotkey. And now both of these have a pivot in the exact same spot, which makes it super easy down the line to get everything organized. So that's good, that's set. This next piece is on the wrong side. We have our pivot on the right, but we want it on the left. So I'm going to use, again, snapping to snap it into place approximately where we think it's gonna go. So let's build up this bookshelf here. And we can take a peek and see how this fits, right? So does this feel right? We can just kind of say, yep, that feels right. So we know that we need to move the pivot to the back corner. We'll put it right here. We can snap that back down. Same with this here. We have bookshelf bottom and top. We can snap that down. And the last piece that we have here that needs to be reset is this one here. So I'm going to temporarily just move these pieces up again. They're going to go back to the world origin. This is just to quickly help us get everything aligned. So I'll move this into place where it's supposed to go. Right? We can make sure everything still feels and looks right. And it does. So let's place our pivot here in the corner. And double check our snapping. Right? And everything snaps just fine. So now we can go one last time and snap everything to the world center. Awesome. So now we've got our proper modular pieces. I can take these ones that are finished and I'm going to move them into kit. So now we have an empty testing bed, but that's okay. Because as we create more blockout pieces down the line, again, they'll go through that same process of being moved from testing to our working file into our kit. So the way we keep everything organized. All right. So now we want to get exporting these, right? Now that they are proper kit pieces, we can start exporting them right into Engine. That's really all we need to do to get them set up. We just need to make sure our pivots are in a way that it can all snap together. So let's go ahead and, oops, actually I'll pull up the slides. So what we want to do in this case is build up blueprints or prefabs. We have here an opportunity to use a lot of blueprints because we have the same mesh section in Arcade repeating over and over and over again. So let's get in here and start exporting our meshes. So I'm going to Control-Alt-Shift-E. I'm going to be exporting these as FBXs. Actually, there's one last thing I want to check, is just that my face orientation is good. And I want to check that my scale is applied to all of my objects. So scale of 1, right? This one needs a rotation applied to it. So just Control-A, apply all transforms. And we're going to have to do that for all of these.
Can't you just select everything and do that?
Yeah, some of them I'm just checking. It'll unlink your duplicates, but that's fine because we're kind of done with that test bed.
Excuse me.
Yep.
Which selection do you get to view the faces again? Like the blue?
Oh, I have a thing for it, but if you go up here, it should be under face orientation. It's just under the overlays.
Okay. And how do you turn it into that? Also, you have to just manually select it?
Turn it into what, sorry?
Never mind. Also, when you export it, should you like put everything in one object? I mean, like, does it even matter if you, like, split everything? Would it just export better?
Splitting everything because later down the line, when we're updating these, I want to make changes to one specific model at a time, not the entire project. So yes, also because of the way it's named and exported, it is just better to do it individually. I'm sure there's batch export ways, but doing it individually is just, you have a lot more control over what's going on.
Okay, so the right protocol is that for every single part of like one like structure to be exported in like individually, and
Yeah.
like except what about the characters? Should they be exported like all like if the anatomy is separate? Like should you export the whole thing or like at least like?
A character should be one piece. Yeah, it should be one model. This is like the whole environment, right? So we got to break it down. There's a number of reasons to break it down like this, but let's see. We'll get to that when we get to the blueprints. So we just export things now based on what we've made. So this is the bookshelf bottom. I'm just going to export settings here. You can see I've already got a thing called library projects. I think we talked about this last week, right? But I'm setting it to mesh and applying my transforms, making sure I'm applying modifiers, all the good stuff. So let's find the projects. This one. Yeah. Go to modeling 2 here. And this is the bottom bookshelf. So we'll call it SM for static mesh and bookshelf underscore bottom. You can pick whatever naming convention you like as long as it's consistent. So once that's exported, I'm just going to hit hide. So it's this process over and over. Export, hit H, next piece. Export, this is bookshelf top. Export, hide, next piece. Export. Yep, Ethan.
So you were saying about exporting as separate files.
Yes.
That's just because you don't want to have to open this entire thing to edit them?
Well, when you export them as one file, they're all joined.
In Unreal Engine, when you can import them as separate meshes.
You can, but there's still things going on. I'm not entirely sure what happens in their back end.
You face problems, but I'll trust that I shouldn't do it. That's fair enough.
This just gives you more control. It's really up to you how you decide to do that. I prefer to name these in here just quickly, but I'm pretty sure if you're using it that way, you'd actually have to go in and name the mesh. So you can see all my meshes, their references are still just based on whatever they were made out of. So Cubo 1, Cubo 2. I don't think Unreal looks for object names. I think they use mesh names. So you have to rename everything twice. It's just, I don't know, I find it a pain. And I think this is just easier for exporting, because if I have 3,000 of these things in my one object, importing and exporting every time I update one piece is going to take forever. And that's also just not very fun.
Can you imagine LFS cloning as well?
Yeah. The other part of this is I can quickly just take any of these and make a high or low poly out of it. I don't need to re-export them again and save it somewhere else outside of the project. It's just right there. I can use it.
Get LFS, right?
So there are quite a few reasons. Again, up to you, really. I know that actually environment artists, sometimes what they'll do to save on storage space is, so earlier I showed all of those rocks and mountains and everything. They'll export those all as one piece so that when the engine makes its draw calls, it will treat all of those as the same model and they'll all be rendered in one draw call instead of having to do one for each tree, one for each rock, one for each thing, right? Yep, it's basically batching them in a very modular way. So again, world's kind of your oyster there, up to personal preference. If you find success batch exporting it, by all means. This is just kind of how I'm going to go about it.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So, we'll just keep going, right? This does take time, which is unfortunate, but we can export our pillar next. Hide it. Facade pillar. Make sure your naming is consistent and make sure your export settings are consistent. And these export settings, they aren't just for you. Your whole team needs to maintain these export settings. It's the only way to keep your project in check. So that was a common problem we have. I've seen it on every year, fourth years even, is they'll have parts of the team using different export settings, and what happens is in Engine, you'll end up with, that'll have to update. There we go. In Engine, you'll end up with some objects where you drag them into the scene and they're just sideways, right? Because somebody exported them with Y up and somebody exported them with Z ups, right? So make sure it's consistent throughout your entire team. I think I just exported this, so we'll move on to floor. Floor, I'm going to call floor underscore A because I know there's going to be more variations on the floor later. So we'll just floor A. Next is the barrel ceiling. There's no variations on this, so. It's good practice to name everything properly with those prefixes. So this one is wall top, so we'll call this wall top.
What does SM stand for?
SM stands for static mesh. So if you were doing like an animated mesh, or you'd call it like an AM, or RM for rigged mesh, or yeah, there's all kinds of options. Really, it's up to you as long as it's consistent. So wall top. And wall bottom. Okay, great. So that's all of our pieces exported and imported into Engine. So let's hop into the other scene here. Yeah, I remember doing this for the first time. It did all that. And I was like, what's the point of the import all button if I have to manually click it for every single thing? Maps. All right. So here we are, right? This is all fine and dandy for testing out our scene. That's great. But we do need to get these individual pieces in here. So this is where blueprints are going to come in, because I don't want to hand place every single one of these walls over and over and over again. So let's go ahead and get started with that, right? All of our meshes are in, they look good. Let's make a blueprint. I'm going to go ahead and click here. Let's make a new blueprint class, right? And we just need an actor. So there's no control or anything. We're just using this to create a series of meshes in space. So I can call this arcade because that's what they're actually called. And when we open it up, we'll be greeted with a bunch of nodes that we don't care about. Oh, unusual. Usually it opens with this. Okay, viewport, even better. So now we're going to build up a chunk of our world that we can repeat throughout. So you'll see we have a very obvious repeating chunk. So let's make a single one of these that we can repeat. So to get started, we can add our floor. So meshes, modeling 2, and we'll just get in here with a floor piece. All right, puts it at 0, perfect for us. Let's add the next piece. So we need a bookshelf bottom, get that in there, right? They'll automatically snap to 0, which is nice. We need a wall bottom, so we'll snap that in there, right? So I'm literally just dragging and dropping, but our origins are in the right spot, so it's quickly making everything good. All right, we finally have to do something. I'll hit this floor because we need to bring it up here. I'm making sure my snapping is set to 100, right? Because everything we've built is built onto this 100 grid. We can drag in our bookshelf bottom here. Oops. This part's a bit annoying, but make sure you don't have something selected when you drag in, otherwise it will parent it to it. So bookshelf top now. Again, still snaps to the grid, super convenient. Pillar A. Right, we left the brute at the bottom, so we are gonna have to move it in place, but we know the pivot's in the right spot, so we can just slot it in there. Facade, and the other part. And then we're going to move those into place as well. So we can take these combined, snap them, excellent, right? So why did we want to move those pivots and everything around to the left corner? Well, you notice here, I can just take this floor now, I'm going to duplicate it and move it up. And then instead of bothering with importing that next mesh, I can just come in here and find that arcade roof. And boop, there it is, right in place. Don't have to really think about it. Gonna do the same thing for the bookshelf here. We'll just duplicate this, or sorry, the wall. Move the wall up into place, switch it from wall bottom to wall top, right? And that was super quick and easy. We have a basic chunk set out. I think that's all the pieces that we made for this example. Sorry? That one we're actually going to do separate. So you can imagine I've got ones on the left and right. So if I have a ceiling on both of them, there will be two ceilings. So that one we can hand place. So there is one caveat that comes with doing this kind of stuff, and that is this idea of not forwards progression. When we build everything up in Blender and export it in, it's great for getting a sense of everything, but it's not super efficient, not very easy to replace, not easy to reuse assets, all this stuff. So we do expect some kind of regression, just don't let it, kind of get your hopes down. So these are some images from when I was working on the scene, just building up it piece by piece. We worked on that block out, that was basically the same thing as what we had. And then I simply updated the existing pieces. So I would re-export the pieces that existed, and it would automatically pick that up. We're gonna do a little bit of that today, but it's all just to establish the vision. Right, so slowly updating pieces more and more. Facades are getting more detailed, pillars are getting more detailed, fences are getting railings, things like that. But I haven't touched a single thing from that block out. Have not touched a single thing in engine. Have not touched a single thing in engine still. Still have not touched a single thing in engine other than to add the table, right? It all just lets me model, lets me be creative without having to worry about fiddling in the engine 24/7, right? Until you fiddle with the engine. So this is the move from a Blender piece to having it built up with the chunks in Unreal. The one caveat is that because they're all individual pieces, it's much heavier on the calculations, which causes issues with your lighting sometimes, with the rendering, with the fog, with whatever, right? So those are things we have to kind of deal with and fix over time. The trade-off to having these be modular chunks over a giant piece is worth it in the long run to dealing with these issues, right? So we'll go over the lighting issues as they come up. We are going to want to establish our lighting soon after we get some refined pieces in. But you can see I have like light bleeding in the back there. The fog has totally ruined it. There's absolutely, everything's just dark and dim, right? And you just kind of work your way up. This one, it's still looking super spotty. There's issues with the light map, right? Eventually though, you will get back to somewhere around where you were before, right? And that's just part of the process. It's not the end of the world to lose a bit of that progress. So let's take this now and save this blueprint. And lose our progress. Goodbye. So now at this point though, we can grab our newly made blueprints here and drag it in. And we'll put this at 0 as it was. And then I'm going to snap it over. Right? Our floor pieces are 4x4. So we know that we need to, in order to match our Blender scene, go 4, 8, and then I believe it's 12, because we have 3 pieces in between.
I think you just moved 3 on that last bit.
Or it might be uneven. No, yes, you're right. If you know the math, you can just punch it in. -1200, boom. Now comes the fun part. We just grab this mesh, and as I move with Y, I'm also going to hit Alt, and that's going to make a duplicate. So you might have been wondering why I only made 1/2 of the blueprint. It's because the next piece is going to fill that same half. So Alt, hold, move, Alt, hold, move. Alt, hold, move.
Good question.
Yep.
How do you deal with like overlapping geometry? Like, do you have to manually delete it, or is it okay to just leave it like? Because like when you do something like this, for example, wouldn't like there's edges that are just like merged together, like overlapping? Would it even matter, or are you just like?
There are some, but for the most part, ignoring it. Depends on where it is. As I said kind of last week, there was a similar question, but when the geometry is crashing through, the player can't see it. So it's not an issue with the player, it's an issue with potentially your lighting, it's an issue with potentially wasting UV space, it's an issue with potentially wasting geometry. But if you can overlook those things in certain situations, then it's just fine, right? So here I've got the floor and that colliding together, but I haven't even got the fence set up here yet. So I know that won't be visible. And the amounts of texture space and geometry I'm losing by leaving two vertices here, the time and effort it would take to make this snap up perfectly, and that would cause issues because this floor is like, it's the same floor I'm using down here, so I can't have holes and everything, so I have to make a separate floor, and like by the time you reach all those conclusions, it was way easier to just leave it and cover it up in the first place, right? So it's situational for sure, but yeah, there are times where you can just crash geometry through. All right, so that's, you know, one side of our arcade done. And now we can come in here and do our barrel ceiling. So we know that, you know, we want to do that separately. So grab that real quick, drag it in, zero it out. And we can't use any fancy tricks for this one really, we just got to do it old fashioned. So come up here, drag it in, place it where it belongs. Should be snapped one back, I believe. Yep. And we're just going to do the same thing. Alt D, move back, Alt D, move back. Kind of annoying, you have to let go of Alt and then repress it to get it to duplicate. Another thing you can do here is I've got it set to 100, and Unreal's kind of dumb, so it only lets you do it in like multiples of 10 or 5. But if your pieces were 500, for example, centimeters, then you could just be like quick snap, quick snap, quick snap. I unfortunately can't just type 400 in here, so we have to do it bit by bit. Okay, great. So there is one caveat to all this, and that is at the end here, right? Because we only do the 1/2, there is a piece missing. So we will have to manually build up this one section.
Can I stick a wall there?
But building up one section is a hell of a lot easier than building up everything. So at this point, right, everything's in place, it's built up with blueprints, and that means we can go and work individually on our assets. So let's bring something up here. I don't know. Bookshelf top. So the bookshelf top, how it actually works is, whoops, possible to see there. Let's see. Just crank open PureRef real quick. So we have good reference images, so we can see all these little things, but we see it here, these bookshelves on the top floor actually have this cutout in them. So that's how people are able to walk through and in between and everything. So let's just add that cutout real quick, for example. We know because everything's on the bottom left, that's where our cutout's going to be as well. And we know the hole is going to be roughly human sized. So let's work on this.
Oh no, wait, no, there's two different bookshelves. Never mind. All right.
There are two different bookshelves, yes. So I'm not going to do this to scale or proportion or anything. I'm not really thinking about it too much. I just want to get some variation. Right.
Whoa, how'd you do that?
So let's hit what?
You filled those in really quickly.
Yes. So Blender added this a long time ago. It used to be an add-on called F2, but essentially it means you can pick an edge, and if you point your mouse towards another kind of gap and hit F, Blender will figure out which points and fill it.
That's crazy.
So if you set up your topology in a way that it's like easy to understand, Blender will typically understand it, and you can just quickly do stuff like that. So let's quickly go in here and we can do some more stuff.
And what's the button for that? F2?
It's just F.
F.
Yeah, just like making a face. So let's
So she's doing that. Wow.
extrude this. I'm going to separate it even, and then come in here, clean this up. Oh, never mind, forget it. Whoops. I'll duplicate this section here because I want to make it a little bit more detailed. I'll just separate it quickly into its own piece. Just makes it easier to work on. And extrude along normals. There we go. And then I'm going to run another one this way to give some thickness, right? So Gary, to answer your earlier question, a situation like this where I've extruded this out, but I know that this is going to be crashing into a wall. I know that this is going to be crashing into the floor. So I am going to clean these up. I don't need anything here at the bottom. I don't need anything here on the side. And then I'll probably grab the bottom here and just tie it up. So snapping to vertex, grab these, zero them out, snap it. Same thing here. Zero it out. Why is it doing that? There we go.
How did you snap the thing to? Like, what command do you use to do it?
The snapping tool is up here. And I have this on basically 24/7 while modeling because almost everything you make is going to want to snap to something in some capacity. So really good tool to have on hand at all times and learn how to use quickly, right? So like this piece, for example, it's got this weird bevel, taper, whatever to it. I don't really want that. So I know I need to move it over to be even with this one. I can snap it on X, GX, snap to that, GY, snap to that, right? Perfect. This is just to give this a little bit more character.
How did you source the X and the Y for the thing?
When you hit G, you're also able to hit X and Z, right?
Yeah.
And if you combine that with snapping, so if I snap here, it'll only snap to the Z. Yeah, it'll snap to this piece that I'm hovering over, this vertex.
What's the Z key?
Yeah, in this case it's Z. It'll just match the height, right? Whereas if I was to click X, you'll see it's coming over, it's staying on its own Z, but it's moving over on X to match.
Wait, but that only applies when you're using the gizmo. I mean, you're using the automatic transform option, right?
You can do it with this too.
Because you know how like there's certain modes where like you either press the tool and you have to manually move it, or you just directly move it using X, Y, Z, or whatever.
You can use this gizmo too. This one works just fine as well, right? So if I start moving it on X and then I just snap to this point, right? It'll still snap just on X. Start moving it on Z, it'll snap just on Z. So no matter which control scheme you use, it should work. So I'm going to now export this again, right? So I'll just take my newfound little sticking out thing and this piece of my bookshelf, and I'm going to select them both, export, and bookshelf. This is bookshelf top. So again, same export settings and everything. I hit export, and now it's going to automatically update our blueprints. So boom, we now have that little hallway cut out in all of our different blueprints. And we can quickly build up the scene this way. So let's work on something else, for example. So let's do the bottom bookshelves now. Or let's actually just continue with this piece. I'll just take all of this, inset it a good bit, scale it in, mirror it over. And again, this is still the blockout phase, so I'm not looking for anything crazy specific. So let's add here, I'm gonna add just quickly a cube, scale it down until it's roughly bookshelf-esque size. I don't really care too much. Move it again roughly into place, and just duplicate it up. Bink, 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 bink. All right, Shift R to repeat so I can just get a bunch of these really quick. Not looking for perfection because these are going to be replaced later, but this will give a much better sense of what this asset is. Export, right? Boom, real quick, and then we can go back in. It'll update in Unreal. So we can build up our environment really quickly. So let's continue with that idea because we have a bit more time. Let's do the bottom bookshelves, right? So the same idea. I'm just going to quickly grab all of these different pieces and merge them together with J. Oops. Accidentally merged the wrong piece. You want to merge to this one. There we go. We can go to bookshelf bottom and do basically the same thing. So I know that I need to inset this and move it in, duplicate it over, but this one is not hollow like the upstairs ones, so we can just quickly do something like this. And create our faces. All right. And rather than make these new temporary bookshelves, I'm just going to really quickly come in here and nab all these ones. Because why would I bother making more? I'll just duplicate them, separate them, and join them into here. And there we go. Now we've got bookshelves. We can export this as bookshelf bottom. And what do you know? We have bookshelves on the bottom, right? And it's this process over and over that allows us to quickly build up the environment. That's why we want to keep things sort of as modular as possible. So let's do like the wall now. I did promise someone a couple classes ago that we'd have like a quite refined level of polish in just a couple classes. This is how it's going to happen. So let's keep going with the wall. So wall bottom and wall top. Again, we take a quick look at the reference. We know we have these like massive windows in the wall bottoms and tops. So let's start with that. Let's just get a massive window in here. Just going to inset for one. Again, not worried about the proportions. Just trying to get an idea for how everything is. So we know that this needs to be moved up because there's some like seating area or something at the bottom. Also, it's really important to have these good references. And then we're just going to move this in a little bit. Should be fine. Honestly, it's not a big deal. Wall bottom, boom. Wall bottom, boom. Next, wall top. Same thing. We can worry about getting everything organized later. This is fine for now. And look at that. Next would be something like these roofs. They need a end point. So I'm just going to quickly create a spot for this to go. Quick tip, if you're dealing with things like circles and you want to close them out, you can extrude straight down, scale on Z to 0, and then use that snapping again to snap it into place. And now I can quickly fill that hole with F. Boom. Right, slide over the extra vertices to make it all quad based again, and now we've got this section filled in. So we can export that because we know that's how that's supposed to be. Arcade roof. It'll fill in those holes, perfect, right? And we're just working with the reference. Let's do the pillars next. Oops, wrong one. Pillar bottom, we can come in here and just sort of get everything organized a bit better. Move this in a bit. We know that there's a second. So this is this idea of using kind of proxies to place everything. I know that there's a second kind of plinth in the front here from our reference images. We can see where the statues are on top of. There's these second bits. And I want to make sure it all lines up. So again, I want to make sure the pivot is right in the same spot as this pillar because it'll always be in front of a pillar. I'm going to make a cube. Doesn't matter where it is. I'm going to create an edge loop right around the middle of this object. And that'll give me something that I can snap to. So now if I hit G, Y, and I hover over that middle vertex, I know this is perfectly aligned in the middle of that pillar. and we can move it into place and get everything else kind of sorted out from there. So we know it's perfectly aligned. Let's scale it down some more, and start snapping things together in edit mode. So we'll snap the bottom to here, right? That feels about the right size. Let's set the pivot to the same point as the pillar so we know it'll go in the right place. And then we can start extruding this up to about the right height. I believe they're about yay tall. This one, there's nothing going on top, really. There's nothing, it's all very natural, so I don't need to worry about how this fits into the grid as long as it has a good feeling shape. That's all that really matters for this one. So we'll drag this in a bit more until I have a good feeling shape. Maybe we want to do a little bit more extra detail, right? It really doesn't matter at this stage, but we can get some small bits like that in just to help with the feel. We can take the bottom here, and I want these to line up, so I'm going to work on them together at the same time. My scaling felt weird, so I just need to quickly apply my scaling and location to all of these. And now I should be able to do this together. Perfect. Something like this. Right? Looks kind of terrible, but again, it's just a block out, so we don't really care. So this piece, I will call it, I don't know. I think I called them bust pillars, because that's where the sculpted busts were going. So I'll just call it that. And I'll export this, and I'm going to do it the same way, you know, SM_sculpture pillar. So we can import that just like we've imported everything else. I'm going to go into my blueprint because I don't want to hand place it, find arcade, and let's add this in here. So, you know, exact same process. Find the mesh and sculpture pillar, drag it in, and move it in the same spot. And I didn't even need to do that. I forgot. The whole reason I set up the pivots this way is so I could just take this pillar, duplicate it, and then switch it. Oop, way easier. It's in the same place. It's already there. We know it's exactly in the right spot. Another reason that's good is because let's say this pillar just happened to be offset by a tiny amount. Well, now I know that this still lines up with the pillar, which is all I really care about. If the pillar is off by like an inch, I really don't care that much unless it's screwing with everything else, but I never would have noticed that the this bit was offset from it, right? So it just helps keep everything together. So we can save that now, and you'll notice it's been added to all of our different pieces, right? So real quickly, in the last, I don't even know, not even an hour, we've quickly built up a ton more detail by separating everything into different kit pieces, like so, and then iterating on them as much as we possibly can while still staying in the blockout stage. So where do we go from here? I'm going to stop covering the basic blockout modeling at this point. The rest of it is up to you. But where you go from there is just continue to build up the assets bit by bit until you have things that are much closer to final. So if we take a look at my pieces here, those are all the ones that still need to be worked on, but the ones that are done being worked on are in their own folders, right? So we have the pillar, right? So I just took that block out I made, I refined it into shape just like we just did 10 seconds ago, and then I just continued to iterate and iterate and iterate and iterate, re-exporting it every time until we ended up with something more final. Yep. Question.
I just wanted to ask if I could see the topology on the solid part of your pillar.
Which bit? This is a high poly, so it's not super meant to be an engine. I still gotta make a low poly and bake it, but yeah, this stuff's all pretty intense. It's all quadded out to be subdivided, but we will learn more about that stuff later. But yeah, it's the same idea, right? This is the exact same piece. It's in the same spot. and I've just gone ahead and sort of finished them. So you would go through and finish every single piece that you have for your scene as we go. So let me hop back in here. Right, you can see that's exactly what I did. So here's my chunk. Just like the chunks that you'd be making, just like the chunk I just made. And it's just been repeated a bunch of times, and I can update this whenever I want, and it will handle 90% of the work for me. If I wanted to add and edit colliders, imagine adding colliders to every single part of this. That'd be a massive pain. But at the same time, I don't want to use mesh colliders because that's just super inefficient. Look at how dense these meshes are, right? So what do? Blueprints. I can add my manual hand-placed colliders to that one section on the blueprint, and I'll be done. To take it a step further, though, I wouldn't even worry about colliders at this point. I would probably say to keep doing what I showed you at the beginning with that cube on the floor. I'm pretty sure even this scene, at the state it's in, there are no colliders yet. Yep, just the one on the floor, so I can move around to get a feel for the environment. It's being nuked because of OBS and the projector and everything. It's too much for my computer to handle, but yeah, that's the idea. So, that's pretty much it for today. Any major questions? Next week, we're going to get into starting with how to UV our kits, because there is a specific way we need to do it. We'll touch a bit on getting the initial lighting set up. I think that will be it for next. Oh, sorry. We will not be doing that. Next week is our next lab assignment. So November 12th, we'll have the AAA workflow lab assignment. It'll be started in the lab. I'll be doing a live demo of the entire assignment. I will finish it start to finish in the hour and a half that we have. And then I've given you 3 days to do something of a similar effect. If you've been following along with all the tutorials so far, you'll be well kitted to deal with this. But it is essentially the AAA workflow, start to finish. I'm going to give you a prompt, just like the other ones, trying to get you in that Ubisoft Next mentality. And then you'll be required to model a high and low poly, create UV maps for your low polys, bake it down, and texture it all according to your storytelling that fits within the prompt, right? So any questions about that while I'm here to get you prepped for next week? It doesn't need to be super complicated. I'm not expecting a whole character, a whole, like, I don't know, crazy thing in 3 days, right? So it'll be pretty bare bones, pretty limited. It's just to get an idea of if you know the workflow and if you understand the process.
So we're getting prompt. We're making the model, right?
Yes. Yeah. I won't be giving you anything this time. You'll have to understand how to set up your substance file, how to do the modeling, how to bake, right? I'm leaving that all up to you now. Okay. Cool. So then the week after that, yeah, we'll get into UVing environments, textile density, all that fun stuff. And I want to show you trim sheets as well. We're doing some fun things with that. So trim sheets, very important. Little teaser ahead of time, right? But this has a lot of detail.
I'm hoping I can.
And I don't want to model all that detail because it's a ton of vertices and it's a pain. So what we do is we use these things called trim sheets. So I'll just quickly show you what that looks like. If I bring it up, I'll show you how we can use drivers as well. But essentially, we bake these down into a texture that we can reuse. There are a bunch of ways to make this. You can do it in Designer. I chose to model it for fun. And I'll show you we can use drivers to sort of speed things up. So you notice if I click here, it's going to subdivide all of my trims to make them look nicer. And when I'm working on them and I don't want it to slow my computer down, I can undo that. So I'll show you custom driver properties and how we can use that for different parts of our workflow. Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody. I'll end the recording there. We're actually on time.